Hey everyone, welcome to Always on CX and EX. Here we talk about customer experience, employee experience, and everything in between. I'm your host, Josh Chronister. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about the top 5 considerations when evaluating a Microsoft Teams contact center. Let's jump in. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Jon Zoltie, one of our contact center subject matter experts here at AudioCodes, who will chat with us about, what questions you need to ask, what details you need to understand about a Teams contact center before you make the purchase for your organization. So, Jon, it's the time of year where we get a lot of gifts. At the end of December, it's holiday season. I don't know about you, but I have received and given my fair share of gifts that kind of sat on the shelf and were nice to haves. And I think this can kind of segue into what it looks like when we're talking about a contact center, specifically a Teams contact center. A lot of times there's a lot of nice to haves that might sit on the shelf rather than the things that you need, which are nice gifts to have. But I wanted to ask you to kind of kick us off here. It's easy to be blinded by those nice to have objects, but what would you say are like the requirements that someone would want to look for when they're evaluating a Teams contact center?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's often a disparity, as you pointed out, between what people want and what people actually need when it comes to contact center functionality. So when you get that demo from a vendor, you probably get quite wowed and you see those shiny bits that you mentioned, all the bells and all the whistles, and you get quite excited about features that you could have. But it's quite important just to take that little bit of a step back and just say, well, actually, what do we need today? What do we need in the future? What do we need in phase 2 and phase 3? Yes, it all looks great and it all looks glossy and shiny from a demo perspective. But actually, like you just said about things sitting on the shelf, how much of that functionality will we actually need? What won't we use? What are we paying for that we won't actually use? And it's just a good chance just to step back and say, although they look great, what do we need today? Well, how do we replicate what we've got? And then how do we put forward a plan for phase 2 and for phase 3? And then secondly, probably quite important, especially in the Teams world and contact center within Teams world, is just to make sure that that contact center integrates well into that Microsoft Eco environment as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know from my own experience when it comes to onboarding to new softwares and things of that nature, you get that demo, you watch the video of all the shiny things that they're showing. But oftentimes I've found it for myself difficult to start using those things and bring it into my kind of everyday activities. You kind of have those everyday things that you do, you're used to, the way that you use the programs that you have available to you now. But when you adopt something new with all these new features and things like that, it can be difficult to, onboard and have them become like a regular habit, I guess.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
I think it's very easy to think of adding all of these great features and doing it literally on day one. But as you pointed out, especially if you come from a contact center, as a quick example where you're just doing voice at the moment, you're not doing any extra channels, just adding one channel is quite a big piece in terms of onboarding and training contact center agents in learning that new channel, let alone thinking about doing chatbots, voice bots, and 3 different extra channels that you weren't doing yesterday. So it's just taking it in phases, I guess, and not doing too much too quickly.
Yeah. Well, when talking about phases, do you think there should be like a certain amount of time within a phase, or is it more like phase 1 is until you're comfortable and master that, say, just the voice aspects of the tool, or should it be more of like a timeline thing?
I'd say it's the former. It's probably just when you're ready. It'd be too difficult, I think, to say because it will vary from customer to customer. But it's a case, especially when you're migrating something from an on-premise to cloud, that's a big enough step in the first place. Making sure you're comfortable with it, making sure you've replicated what you've got, maybe adding a few new features before then saying, right, we're ready for phase 2 and phase 3. I don't think it should be a specific time, especially if you're not ready at that point as well. There's no point setting a time frame and having to move because you said you would, even though you're not quite ready.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, you talked about how in making sure that the Teams contact center integrates well with Teams? What are the different, can you kind of explain like what are the different types of integrations that Microsoft has for a contact center within Teams?
Of course. So there are now 3 models for connectivity for Microsoft Teams contact centers. There's Connect, Extend, and Power. In very short detail, without giving too much on the technical side, the Connect model was first, and that works via what we call a SIP refer. So effectively, that means their call comes in to Teams. The call then has to go via a SIP refer, go back out of Teams to go to a contact center that then comes back into Teams. That worked really well, and it allowed a bespoke agent interface, but the call hairpinning in and out of Teams doesn't particularly give a great robust experience. They then moved to the Extend model, which is effectively using APIs. So the call stays within Azure actually and stays within Microsoft from start to finish, which is great. Gives you some reporting capabilities that you didn't have from that Connect model, but some slight limitations around the agent interface and the template that Microsoft give you that you can't change too much in terms of that agent interface. And then the latest and greatest and newer is the Power model. And that is where a call starts and finishes and remains all the way through in Azure. So the call comes into Azure and stays within Azure. It uses what they call Microsoft ACS, which is the Azure Communication Services. And that's the Power model. And ACS is actually the same technology that we use for Microsoft Teams. So when you have a Teams meeting, it's the same technology, ACS, underneath that it's actually utilizing. And that's the latest and greatest and the newest one from Microsoft.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm hearing is if you were to integrate with the Power model, for instance, you would be getting kind of peace of mind when it comes to like stability and security that you already know you have in something in Microsoft Teams itself.
Exactly. So yes, from a telephony perspective, from a voice and security and robustness, I suppose you get that. But also the extra element of it kind of connects, or it gets the Extend and Connect. It combines those 2 previous models, uses the best of both to create something better as well. So you are free as a vendor, for example, to be able to produce a completely bespoke agent interface in that Power model, as well as utilizing all the infrastructure from Microsoft underneath it as well.
So, we covered the 3 models. All great models, kind of depends on your use case and what you're looking for, I guess, as a customer. And just speaking of use cases, with a contact center being within Teams, often the entire organization is using Microsoft Teams as their UC. So if you have a contact center integrated in there, it sounds like, you could probably scale it across more than just the main service desk. What other departments in the organization do you see as being a good fit for something like contact center capabilities?
It's a good question. So we've seen some really powerful results for a number of specific departments. I'm sure people out there can think of their own examples, but some of the departments that we've seen some really, really good results in by extending contact center capability into their environment are things like sales department. Really, really big one for those guys is the reporting capability and data analytics. So yes, the routing capability to be able to route calls to the right salespeople based on CRM, for example, the right account manager, or based on product. But where it's really, really powerful is identifying some of the reports and the data analytics that you get from that. So based around how many calls are people actually taking, how long are they spending on the phone? You then tie that back to how well are those salespeople performing against that telephony data or that contact center data to identify, is spending longer on the time more beneficial, or less time on the phone is beneficial. You start to build a picture about what good looks like with all of those data and the analytics. Next key area that we've seen some really, really good results in are things like IT help desks. Typically and historically, they're almost like a forgotten about department. They don't tend to get contact center functionality, but being able to give them some advanced and some really clever routing based on self-serve and automation has been really, really powerful. So things like raising tickets or being able to automate the raising of tickets through the IVR system and stopping calls coming into those those IT help desk agents of people saying, I just want to raise a ticket because my computer's broken, automating that as an example. Also automating when they want an update on an existing ticket, so they can call in and say, here is my ticket number, what's the latest on it? Is it going to be fixed soon? And being able to answer that automated through sort of almost a bot is really, really powerful, stops a lot of calls coming into those departments as well. I'd say the third area is probably what we call 24/7 departments. So things like travel desks, things like security desks, giving them the flexibility to, yes, again, have some advanced IVR and some advanced routing capabilities, but things like out of hours routing and emergency calls, and when one department closes, what happens to that call? What happens out of hours? Where does it go to? Is someone on shift? Is someone need to be answering a mobile phone rather than their desk phone, for example? All sorts of different use cases. But I'd say those three departments we've seen a huge amount of powerful results from, actually.
Yeah, definitely. That being on top of, the main service desk use cases.
Exactly.
Almost like just the tip of the iceberg. So you went over quite a lot there as far as all the different departments of where a team CCaaS could be integrated with. And that sounds like it could be quite a large deployment and time that it would take to deploy in an organization. We talked about phases earlier. It could be maybe that if you're evaluating a team's contact center, you start with just phase one, and then the next department is phase two, and you go through there. But I guess if someone is evaluating a team's contact center right now, what is the type of answer that they should maybe expect when asking the question, how quickly can this solution be deployed?
That's actually a really powerful and a really good question to ask. So as a customer, you're speaking to a vendor who's showing you a contact center, their contact center solution. Asking that question about deployment, I think, is a really good example or a good indication as to how complex it might actually be. So if that vendor says, maybe it's 8 to 12 weeks to actually deploy it, then there's a good chance that you can start to think, well, that's probably quite a big and a bulky type of contact center product. It then starts you to then question, well, how easy, if that's complex, how easy is it for me to make changes as an end user? Is it complex? Does it need professional services? Does it need an IT person who knows how to write scripts to be able to just change the opening hours or create a new agent with some skills, for example? So it's a really good question to ask, because the result being, well, if it takes 8 to 12 weeks, I'm starting to think, is it big? Is it bulky? Is it going to be very difficult for me to make changes? Am I going to need to assign someone an IT level internally to be able to make changes? Am I reliant on the contact center vendor to make changes? The less time it takes to deploy, probably the easier decision it is, knowing that it's going to be a little bit more lightweight, and therefore it's going to be easy to manage.
Yeah. I think in this world of SaaS applications, we're used to the self-service, versus in the past when you had to reach out to someone to change the code. And you gave, if you want to give that example, you told me a couple of days ago of needing to change something that was super simple on a Friday.
Yeah, well, the typical example that I ran you through the other day was in my old world, in the on-premise contact center days. It was very, very, I suppose, script heavy and very, very technical contact centers. And if you're in a contact center on a Friday, you suddenly realize that Monday was a bank holiday or a holiday of some sort, and you hadn't changed the IVR with your opening hours. And it's almost no word of a lie that the process that you had to go through to make that change was ludicrous. So as a contact center manager, you'd have to reach out to your own internal IT department. We need to change the IVR for Monday because our opening hours are different. That IT department probably has to reach out to the vendor of the contact center solution, if not a partner of the vendor contact solution. They then have to request that an ad moves and changes. That that costs typically in the old world. So you would then have to write a PO or an invoice to actually make that change. That then goes back through all of those different partners and vendors that I've just mentioned. And the end result is possibly a 10-day turnaround for a change that only takes a couple of minutes, but you also needed it changing on the Friday, and 10 days later it should have been changed, 7 days previously. So it's kind of joking aside, but it was a really, really difficult and long process that thankfully the cloud world and the CCaaS world has solved with what I call clicks, not code, and having a supervisor being able to make that change on the fly really quickly and easily online, rather than having to make all of that request is a change for the better in my eyes.
Yeah, and maybe not having to have very specific technical knowledge on how to make the change too. It can just be a couple clicks. I know there's a couple platforms I use now that I'm thankful that's how they're built. Just a couple clicks and we're done, and it saves hours, if not weeks, of requests and emails and changes and things like that are really helpful to the customer. That's who we're serving, and it's specific. So. All right, so we're coming up on the end here, and you shared an interesting word with me the other day, and that was just ilities. So we were talking about, just a contact center in general. What are, say, the reliability and other, ility words that you should have when you're evaluating a team's contact center? Maybe you can walk us through what are the ilities that you have listed.
Yeah, well, the background to that question because there's a little bit of a cliche of a contact center being a profit center rather than a cost center and so on, but it is true. So whilst it's expensive to run a contact center, they generate huge amounts of revenue and profit for the business. And they can be the difference between winning and losing a customer. So if you've got the wrong contact center, if it's not reliable, if it's dropping calls, if there's poor audio quality, if, even worse, you're getting rejected calls, for example, it can have a huge impact on the business. As a quick example, one type of industry that we deal with quite a lot is universities. They have a really, really strong and what I call a hard ROI on telephone calls. And as an example, during clearing, they're receiving calls from prospective students who need a last-minute placement at the university. That for the university, that customer, I guess, or student is worth tens of thousands of pounds for them. So missing that call or that poor quality call or the call dropping, for example, can cost them literally tens of thousands of pounds. So it's imperative for a university and obviously other businesses in a similar vein that they have what I call those ilities. And that's what I shared with you the other day. Now, I say there's 5, and it's because 4 doesn't quite sound enough. And for 5, I had to make up my own. But typically it's reliability, functionality, scalability, stability, and then what I call robust stability, which is the extra one that I made up just to make it 5. That sounded like a nicer, rounder figure. But the idea is having all of those is really imperative, especially if you're in a contact center where it makes a difference between winning and losing customers and business and revenue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's easier to, retain a customer than it is to acquire a new one. Yeah, especially when it comes to universities. There's a lot of universities out there to choose and pick from, and
exactly, they'll just move on to the next one. If you don't answer or there's poor audio, it will be the next phone call would be to the next university.
Yeah, same for any other business as well.
Yeah,
especially for others, because it's a little bit easier to become a new customer of say just a consumer brand than it is to switch universities. But I wanted to kind of follow up on that. What are some of the effects that could be placed on some of these, on the 5 kind of ilities that you mentioned?
Probably related to some of the previous conversation we've had, I guess. One of the bits that we see from an audio perspective and just limiting the issues or the number of issues that could potentially happen is the Microsoft Teams connectivity piece. So utilizing Power, for example, and having the call stay within Azure and utilizing ACS is going to be a lot more robust than using one of the others that are reliant on APIs or reliant on SIP transfers and calls coming in and out and just adding layers of complexity or layers of potential areas that can go wrong, I suppose. And then the other bit, probably the same as that we were just discussing about the lightweight element. And if you've got a really heavy professional services and technical product that takes a lot of work and takes a lot of coding or really experienced technical people to make changes, again, it adds complexity and it adds time and it adds something else that can go wrong when you're trying to make configuration changes and the system breaks, for example. So probably a combination between the right product with the right Microsoft Teams connectivity, the right product in terms of lightweight so that changes can be made quickly and easily without having to rely on those technical guys that could potentially create even more problems further down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, John, that was good. I know you have all this knowledge, especially with all the customers and partners and speaking with the product team, all the conversations that you get to have. I know we kind of talked about this topic, a few weeks ago and discussed what we wanted to chat about in this episode of Always on CX. And we knew that, there's a lot of questions that come up that you've had from prospects and people who are interested in a Teams contact center. And we found that, if there's repeat questions, that means that there's probably more and more people who are wondering or asking those questions as well. But that does bring us to the end of this episode of Always on CX and EX. John, thank you very much. We appreciate your knowledge here. It was so good. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you like this episode, please feel free to give it a thumbs up below, and we'll see you next time. Bye everyone.